Welcome to Dialogue, Your Excellency. Let's look at Ebola. How do you assess the international coordination in fighting this epidemic disease, and what's happening now here in your country?
Well, let me first say that this is a terrible disease. I mean, something that it's traumatic, it's terrifying. But I want to say that if the international community came and China, let me single out China, because China was the first to send support to Liberia through a charter plane that took medical equipment and supplies. China also built an Ebola training unit that was managed by the Chinese military, and in that way perhaps brought global attention to the seriousness of our tragedy. International response did come later, and the United States and others came very heavily, but it was later. Yet, the credit of it all goes to the Liberian people too, because Liberia was the hardest hit among the three countries. And there were these doomsday projections, that 1.3 million people would die, 20,000 people would die every month. And I took the position that, no, we're not going to allow it. And call upon the Liberian people to respond by taking charge, by taking ownership, by protecting their own lives and livelihoods, by not depending upon anybody else. And they did. Yes, they were empowered through the international assistance, but their own determination by the communities that went around, identified the sick, responded to that, picked up the dead, is largely what did it. And I'm so glad that Liberia demonstrated that we had the ability to take charge of our affairs, the ability to win, the ability to defeat this enormous energy. So let me, through this medium, say thank you to China for giving us that very early lift.
You're welcome, by the way. You know why China went to your country very quickly? Because we are still licking the wounds of SARS that broke out back in the year 2003, and we paid a heavy price. If we went to your country late, thousands of more innocent lives would have been lost. And therefore, it is fighting unconventional threats such as the Ebola is one of the few areas where perhaps industrial nations and developing countries can join hand in ushering in a collective future. Many major economies keep a close eye on the African markets. So how to let them fish instead of giving them the fish is the key to success. Do you agree?
I fully agree. Teaching us to fish gives us sustainability in our development effort. And so the dialogue has changed. The quality of governance in Africa has changed tremendously. Today, peaceful transition of power is something that's happening all over the continent. Better accountability, transparency. Those are all the things that are making Africa well positioned to become a very good economic performer.
Do you think China has a very special niche in your foreign policy and generally for the African Union?
China has a strong niche in the Liberian economy. China is our best trading partner right now. China has established itself in Liberia, in most of Africa. Its support for development is now very well widespread. And China, look, it's not only Africa. I go around the world and I can tell you that China has penetrated countries all over the world, even the most developed countries, because of the state of their industrialization, because of the effectiveness of their trading policies, and because of their support, for countries, particularly developing countries, whose purchasing powers are now on a rise. And that's why today they say Africa rising. So I think the market for China will continue to be Africa and its potential to expand in its own development effort, to expand per capita income.
Both China and Liberia will have to learn. We are both developing countries. What do you think of the relationship between China and most of the developing countries in the South? And what experiences could we share in shaping governance of the world?
China has had a long experience of development, and so it still has have the semblance of a country that is still rising, a country that is still developing. But then China is one of the most industrialized nations, the second economic power in the world. And so that puts you in a very unique position to be able to cooperate with nations all over the world. China can compete, can relate to the United States or to any European power because it is equal to them in every aspect. China can relate to any African country because it does have that experience of having to put itself up by its bootstraps and having the experience of development. And so China is in a very unique position to play a leadership role in supporting African countries, in supporting less developed countries all over the world, sharing its experiences of developing, being able to provide them with the kind of support and assistance and counsel and advice that they need to be able to use the example and best practices of China. And so in the international fora, they do stand out. South-South cooperation is very strong. China is a leader of that. Transformation of the international community, China is a leader in that. And we think China ought to be very pleased and continue to carry out that very important role.
Many people, be they in the West or East, read into China's current status from different perspectives. Having said this, I wonder why many people here in China feel that we are being lectured on many issues, such as human rights, and as if we are always a young student. Despite your allegation that China should be regarded as equal, put on an equal footing on world issues, I'd like to have your comments.
Well, you know, China has a different system, and we're trying to study that system to see how applicable it is to our development experience. As I understand it, China believes in discipline. China believes in systems that conform to precise policies. And so China is not one that takes the time to say, well, you know, did any particular segment of the population get affected by this and that? So once the policy has been determined and the procedure for achieving the results of those policies have been formulated, China believes the best thing to do is to do that. The many countries in the West have a different method. Their method is one of individualism and not one of statism, one of letting individuals do what they want, exercise the rights they want. That has its place. I'm not sure it had served Western countries well. Yes, they are developed, but right now there are cracks. There are cracks in their system because of this individualism, because they have not been able to have the discipline in the society. Some of our African countries, Liberia particularly, which has patterned itself so much after the United States, is feeling the effects of not having a disciplined society that conforms to the agenda of the state.
Do you think wars and violence would alienate women when you examine major power rivalry between China and, for example, the existing sole superpower like the United States? And what is the neutral position of a female perspective?
You know, we always say that females tend to have much more concern about humankind, about the human condition, about caring for people. It comes naturally with a woman. A woman's a mother. And so that sensitivity brings a different dimension to how women manage matters. Women are the managers of the home even though male have dominated. You know, in your home, your wife probably calls the shot, as they say. And that's simply because they do have the ability to impose discipline, the ability to manage, but to manage with a certain caring and sharing. And so today, I think as you see women begin to ascend and to pierce the glass ceilings all over the world, it's because it's the recognition not only of the quest for equality, because it's the right thing to do. As 50% of the population, they're entitled to the same equal opportunities and equities and justice like anybody else, but because they do bring, I think, this extra dimension to how they manage their affairs and how they lead.
There are many successful women politicians around the world. Hillary Clinton, and in South Asia you have Indira Gandhi, president of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. In Scandinavian countries, similarly, you have very good examples to showcase strength of female leadership. Back in the 1980s, we had the Iron Lady of Margaret Thatcher. So what do you think of the strength of such an Iron Lady? And do you think in many areas you are catching up?
I still like Margaret Thatcher. I think she was strong because at that time, the United Kingdom needed a strong leader, and she brought that quality to it. But there's also strength in other types of women. Indira Gandhi was a strong leader, but her method was different. Thousands of other young women will read what they did and how they served the nation, and they will be inspired by that. And so life is nothing when you committed, to being able to move your country forward. And so I just admire all of those strong women, though they may bring to their task a difference in their style, but they brought the strength of leadership to their country.
On the issue of poverty alleviation, I think China and most of the African countries share much of the same language. We still have up to 70 million people below the poverty line. We are wrestling with the issue of how to alleviate the poverty by extending the social security program, giving them equal access to education, job opportunities, so on and so forth. What can you tell us about what you do in your country in the year 2015, when we commemorate the 15th anniversary of the Millennium Development Goal, which was first put forward by Kofi Annan, the former UN chief?
The records show very clearly that the goal of 50% reduction in poverty, as required by the Millennium Development Goal, was in fact achieved. And China had made a lot of contribution to that. But poverty continues. And this is why in the Sustainable Development Goals, the successor to the MDGs, the elimination of poverty is focal, is pivotal. It's the number one goal of the 17, but it's the key goal, as they say, leave no one behind. Let's eradicate extreme poverty. But it's a difficult task. In my country, we are defeated in fighting poverty by the birth rate. Our population is growing so fast that our economy cannot match it to be able to address poverty. And unless we can find policies and measures to reduce the birth rate, it's going to be very difficult for us to achieve the SDGs goals of reduction in poverty. And I suspect that in many countries, the same problem, particularly in African countries where populations are just expanding exponentially, we have to address that. Yet, as economies grow, as diversification takes place, particularly in African countries that have been dependent upon one or two monocultures, I believe effort will be made. It's going to be a tough job.
We'll soon be back in a short while. Please stay with us.
A partnership that's helping transform Africa by teaming up with China. leaders and experts are gathering in Johannesburg to map out the next step. CCTV News will be at the forum to bring you the highlights, the newsmakers, and what it all means to you. Join us in December for our special coverage, only on CCTV News.
Welcome back, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
The United Nations has done a lot of good things since the end of the Second World War, but it needs to be reformed. And the African Union is a strong voice calling for reform of the United Nations, for example, by listing one of the strong competitors, such as Africa or Nigeria or whatever, being yet another permanent member of the UN Security Council. When we have discussed the issue of poverty alleviation, of a Millennium Development Goal, what do you think of the African voice at the United Nations? Is it high time?
It is high time. The international administrative architecture has to change. There was a time when Western powers, which dominated global finance and trade, took key leadership roles, all the prime leadership roles in the international arena. It may have been appropriate for those times, but times have changed. And now it's time for reform in the UN system. I think that is recognized by all, including the Western powers. South-South has a position on that. That it's time that countries that today are those that are just as dominant, just as leading in all aspects of national and international endeavor, should have their rightful place at the table. Africa is most affected by Security Council resolutions. And so we need a voice there so that we can be a part of what decisions are made that affect our lives. The recognition of that is there. Is how do we now put a little bit more pressure by unity among ourselves in being able to get this reform. It has to come. It can be delayed, as it has been, but it cannot be denied. It's time.
But do you think Africa is ready to assume world leadership once it was to be listed as yet another permanent member of the UN Security Council?
Yes, we are.
Why?
Because we've grown up. Mm-hmm. Because we too have a say. You know, we too have leaders that are holding important positions, even today, even in the international system. So why should we be denied this one particular club? You know, this club dominated by just a few superpowers. Africa has demonstrated that it can not only manage its own affairs, that it can compete effectively. There's differentiation in Africa, you know that. Not all African countries have reached the same level of ability or capacity or resources or leadership.
It's exactly part of my next question, Your Excellency. Actually, the diversified spectrum of African politics could be showcased somehow by the two ends of the spectrum, South Africa and Northern Africa. You know what's happening in North Africa, where you have thousands upon thousands of people fleeing their homes due to the Arab Spring and the current civil strife in Syria, due to military intervention from outside for one reason or another. In the post-Mandela, Nelson Mandela era in South Africa, the issue of racial discrimination still persists, and the economic development is very much in question due to the domestic woes, economic and political alike. Having said this, what do you think of your ability to have internal coordination so that you can deliver a strong and a single voice to safeguard in fundamental interests of developing countries and to safeguard the image and fundamental interests of Africa at the United Nations?
You know, Africa is seeking a unified voice in all of these areas. That has not been fully achieved because We do have historical relationships of influence, you know that. And so most of the time, if you come from a certain block or another block, you tend to take a position that's influenced by the patron of that block. But as we move toward, within the context of the African Union, being able to identify those issues of common concern and interest to Africa, that voice that is coming, and that voice then is also playing out in the South-South cooperation, whether it is through the G77, which has a very strong influence in international affairs, particularly the United Nations. And so, you know, the diversity will be with us for a while, being able to unify totally on whatever area we're dealing with is something that is going to take some time, but I think you begin to see us moving in the right direction. I don't think one ought to be concerned with what happens with the Arab Spring and Tunisia and all of that. That's part of the evolution of democracy. So many other countries, you know, south of the north have gone through their own processes of being able to democratize. And so it's happening there. That in no way affects the relationship between the South and the North, and our moving toward trying to unify our position to ensure that we take our rightful place in the world's arena. Is Liberia paying a heavy price for democratization and freedoms? I wonder, I ponder that, and I look at the differences, and sometimes I think we have to find a different way to be able to achieve our development objective. I also look at some countries that have very strong governance, a certain amount of democratization, but a certain amount of discipline. And I see that they are able to achieve their development goals much faster.
Do you think you'll be inspired by the role model of Singapore, whose founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, exercised a very tough discipline, very tough rule of law? The opposition voice has been very weak in the parliamentary election, and yet the economy of Singapore has been the envy and admiration for millions around the world.
Let me come home. I'm inspired by the discipline of Rwanda and Ethiopia. Because I think today they are the fastest growing economies in Africa. I do believe that those who have been able in their policies, in their laws, to ensure that discipline is a part of the modus operandi, have been able to go much further in the achievement of the development goals. You know, that's all I'm saying. Whether it's Singapore, or Ethiopia, or Rwanda, or some other country. And I just think there are examples that need to be looked at by all of us who are trying our best to achieve rapid reform and development.
Now I can figure out why you have been a fan of Lady Thatcher, the Iron Lady. You want to have a discipline to put the disparate country together for navigating an independent course of the economic development. But don't you think you're going to pay a price because you're going to draw fire from the other side across the aisle in your parliament?
Let me say Liberia is in a unique position in this regard. And I find myself in a very difficult position. Yes, I'd love to have the discipline, but my country also have come through 2 decades of war and violence and a history of political repression. So where's the balance in trying to ensure that they do have freedoms that they've been denied for part of the entire life of the country, and at the same time the discipline to achieve development goals? And so this is why you find being caught in a situation of being called the Iron Lady because I believe in discipline, and call my Ellen because I know that I have to allow certain freedoms that people have been denied. And so we make progress as we find this balance, but it's a very difficult balance. And sometimes I get torn between where do you shift the emphasis on one or the other, allowing freedoms or imposing discipline.
Don't you think there's no therapy at all for the structural and deep-rooted contradiction between efficiency and social justice?
I do believe it.
So you are pessimistic a little bit.
Yes. It's difficult. It's difficult. Each country will have to find their way. And I tell you, at the end of the day, people do find a means of formulating the balance that they need to achieve their goals. This is why there is progress. The progress may not be at the level anticipated or the level possible, but it does happen. And so today you see when people talk about countries rising, Africa rising, it's because they manage despite these difficulties.
Thank you very much for being part of this dialogue about what it means for the rise of the rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.